Well, I think this has just been a wonderful, wonderful afternoon, and I've been thinking, once I decided that I was going to retire, and as this semester was winding down, it led me to kind of spend a lot of time looking back on my career and thinking about what's been really most gratifying, most important to me over the 47 years that I've been teaching at Columbia and working on Japan and traveling back and forth between the two countries. And there are many things, but we don't have any. There isn't a lot of time, and I want to talk just a word about what's been the most important, the most gratifying aspect of my career, and that's been the students that I've obviously seemed to have scared, but that I also helped train, and that I've seen mature into the leading intellectuals dealing with East Asia in this current generation. And so, for me, listening to all of these people today speak here with such expertise and insight, there's nothing more as a retiring professor that you can really be gratified by than watching these people in action. So I want to thank each and every one of them who spoke today, and I have other students in the audience, and we could have had a 2 or 3 day seminar easily and covered a lot of other issues as well, because the study of Japan at this university has been this university has been, I think it's been the major center outside of Japan itself for the study of Japan. In fact, it's so important in the study of Japan that we have lots of Japanese students who come here to study about Japan, get a different perspective than you get back at home. So that's really wonderful. Now I was thinking too, what are the issues that this generation of Japan scholars, East Asian scholars, and the coming generations of East Asian scholars should be talking about? Because they're different than when I was, 40 years ago, and different from what it was 20, 30 years ago. So what are the issues now? Well, I think it's clear from the focus of the conversation today that one of the most important driving issues is about Japan's role in the region and where the region is going and how the region is going to deal with Japan. So in just a few minutes, let me suggest 4 or 5 areas that I think need a lot of attention and are not getting sufficient attention yet. One is the fundamental change that has occurred in the Japanese domestic political system over the last 2 decades. Today, we didn't have much talk about political parties, political organization, the relationship between the ruling party and the LDP, and the opposition, between the LDP and the opposition. But where the dynamics of Japanese domestic politics today are in many ways fundamentally different from what it was when a number of you took my course 20 years or more ago. There has been an extraordinary concentration of power in the office of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, or the Kante, the Prime Minister's headquarters, it controls the cabinet. This was not true in the past, when the cabinet was kind of a collective decision-making body, and cabinet ministers were sort of the CEO of their ministry, and the Prime Minister was kind of the chairman of the board of the whole operation. Mr. Abe is the CEO. He's in charge, and no cabinet minister is going to speak out of school, say things that the Prime Minister is not going to like, and he wouldn't last. And they don't last, but they do last because they stick with Abe's agenda. He is the the Prime Minister's office is in control of the party. It's not the kind of coordination between very powerful party institutions and party leaders and the executive, the Prime Minister's office. This Prime Minister runs the LDP, and the LDP does what the Prime Minister wants him to do. There's been a change in the relationship between the Prime Minister's office and the bureaucracy. Japanese bureaucracy is very strong, but the bureaucrats have always been sensitive to what politicians need to have happen. But the autonomy of the bureaucracy, I think, has been much more constrained. And one of the interesting examples is the power of the National Security Council. I don't think any of us could have expected that an NSC inside the Prime Minister's office would be able to coordinate the Defense Ministry, the Foreign Ministry, other ministries, and actually play the kind of role that it plays, say, in the United States. But that's a big change. So for the younger students in the audience who are thinking, well, thank God I don't have to do my dissertation under Jerry Curtis. But when you think about, if you're thinking about doing graduate work and doing dissertation, what explains these changes? What do these changes mean in terms of the dynamics of political action? What do they mean in terms of Japanese democracy? One of the concerns about Japanese democracy is the utter weakness and the disarray in the opposition camp. Mr. Abe is a very strong prime minister, and that's in some ways very good, but it's not good not to have any strong competition, not to have any other leaders in the LDP who compete with them, not to have any opposition parties that stand a reasonable chance of coming to power, not to have any opposition parties that know what they want to do that's different from what Mr. Abe wants to do. You know, all this talk about the national security legislation and the opposition to it from the DPJ and so on. You know, I was in Japan a good part of that time. You watch on TV these DPJ Diet members who I know well, and who, if anything, are at least as far on the right in terms of their hawkish views as the LDP, with a straight face, saying that this legislation is dangerous. No, this is not real. This is not real. This is pure politic. This is irresponsible politicking. So the problem for the political opposition in Japan is, what are they opposed to? What do they support? What do they offer that the LDP doesn't offer? If they don't come up with an answer, that is not a good message. That is not good for Japan's democracy. And finally, and I'll move on. The old system, which I've written so much about, the LDP before 2000 or so, the old system had a system. It was a system. There was an inherent system of checks and balances. Factions balanced the Kante, the prime minister's power. The opposition, especially when the socialists were strong, this goes way back, but in the 60s and 70s, they couldn't come to power, but they could surely put a brake on a lot of things that the LDP wanted to do. That's why Mr. Abe is still trying to do what his grandfather wanted to do in the late 1950s as far as constitutional revision and so on. The agenda hasn't changed. If anything, the agenda has gone back to what it was 40 years ago. But now he has a chance of actually doing some things because the checks and balances are weaker. That's one big area that, you know, nobody is working on. It's extraordinary. No one is working on these questions, of fundamental questions about the functioning of Japan's political democracy. The second is, again, about domestic politics, and that is the politics of policy in a country where the economy is and will continue to grow, and to grow slowly. Many years ago, Jim may not remember this, but you wrote a paper at the Shimoda conference, must have been in 1970 or 69 or 70. And I remember the title of it was Growth for What? Remember writing that paper? You wrote this paper, Growth for What? And that is a good question to ask about Japan today. How do you get economic growth, and the growth for what? Japan faces new kinds of problems. Social inequality is a real growing issue in Japan. The gap between really very rich people and very poor people. The whole problem of the policy issues relating to an aging population, the extraordinary cost of medical insurance, pensions. How are you going to pay for this? So there's welfare programs. You know, Hugh mentioned about 60% of the Japanese labor force is employed in full-time jobs where you kind of assume that unless the company is really in desperate shape, the last thing, you know, in the US, the first thing you do is lay off a fire. In Japan, so the last thing you do is lay off a fire. But it is changing. And job security is becoming less and less certain. But the welfare programs for the unemployed, long-term unemployment insurance and so on, are very backward in Japan. How do you pay for it? In short, there's a lot of issues of political economy which are not the issues of the political economy that was studied in the 1980s when it was, well, you know it was because a number of you worked on it. It's a new set of issues. They're not getting sufficient attention. The third is the changing character of Japanese political leadership. Someone asked earlier, you know, Abe's at least 2 arrows of the 3 haven't really hit the target, yet Abe is popular. Why is he popular? The answer is quite simple. No one can imagine that somebody else in office would do a better job than Mr. Abe. That is the reason. So if you ask on public, you know, in these public opinion polls, do you feel the positive benefits of Abenomics? 70%, 80% of the Japanese respondents say, no, I don't feel it. Do you support Mr. Abe? Yes. And do you support his national security legislation? No. But do you want him to continue in office? Yes. What does that reflect? That reflects the lack of options. That reflects a sense that whatever disappointment you might have in this prime minister, it has to be better than having a revolving door prime minister where every year somebody else comes into office, and by the time he starts to get an idea of what he might, how to do things, he's out. No one wants to go back to that period from Koizumi to second term Abe. But in the old days, and I'm nostalgic for the old days for lots of for many reasons, but one of them being in the old days, the system really worked. The Japanese system worked. From around 1990 or so, then it became a new issue. The system doesn't work. Why? Well, the system of leadership recruitment worked, and anybody who became prime minister in Japan had been finance minister or meeting minister, had been secretary general of the party, had held major positions, so that he was really trained to be the top leader. And people who became leading members in the government similarly were well trained. That's no longer the case. So the whole process of how you recruit leaders, very different now. And I'm very struck by so many young Japanese politicians. As I put it, it sounds better in Japanese than it does in English somehow, but they don't smell like politicians. Seijika no nioi ga shinai? Because they're policy wonks. And they can bore you to death. And they go on TV and they bore the audience to death with technical discussions of some tax issue or another. That's not the role of politicians. The role of politicians is to present a big picture, to try to get the public to understand what are the major choices the country has to make. So I'm concerned about the quality of political leadership in Japan, and I think we have a common issue, whether it be in Europe, in Britain, in the United States, God only knows, or in Japan, about the lack of qualified and attractive political leaders. What explains this situation? I think that's an area of research that simply is not being engaged in enough. Finally, and I only got a minute left, the big area and the big elephant in the room are security policy is the big area. And the big elephant in the room is China. And so we need more systematic research on issues of Japanese security policy. I would say, first of all, I completely agree with what I think was a unanimous view on this panel, that the national security legislation that passed this summer does not represent a departure in any shape or form from post-war Japanese security policy. Japanese security policy has been evolving constantly, gradually, cautiously, for decades, and it has evolved further with this legislation. But there is a new dynamic in U.S.-Japan relations. We worry about getting entangled in some issue that we didn't create, that is a conflict between China and Japan. Why did the U.S. issue a statement of disappointment over Abe's Yasukuni visit? It was not about war criminals, not for us. It was for the Koreans and the Chinese. But for the U.S., it was very simple. And it was stated. It was because that action raised tensions in East Asia. And raising tensions complicates our policies in dealing with China and with the region as a whole. So that requires a lot more. We have to recognize that the dynamic of the relationship has changed. Japanese worry, I wouldn't say abandonment, but they worry about how reliable the American commitment is. So you can't leave this relationship on automatic pilot. There has to be more attention given to coordinating, communicating, and coordinating. And on that point, I think there's been a very important change on the right wing, in the LDP. The right wing in the LDP has long advocated a more autonomous Japanese security policy. I believe, except for some crazies way out on the far right, whose names I won't mention in this for now, but except for people way out, the right wing or the more conservative element in the LDP recognizes there is no way for Japan to have a defense without an alliance with the United States. The support for the alliance for the United States has spread across the political spectrum much more widely than ever before, both to the left and to the right. So I don't worry about autonomy unless the Japanese conclude that we're really incapable and unwilling to fulfill our commitments. That is not going to happen. We will fill our commitments, assuming that Donald Trump doesn't become president of the United States. So finally, the issue is, how do we deal with China? That will be the dominant issue for decades to come in East Asia. And I think the answer is it's not a simple answer, but the answer includes two key elements. We have to maintain a balance of power in East Asia. That is not containment of China, but it is a balance against China. And the U.S. has to play the key role in doing that. And along with that, we have to provide international space for China to participate as a leader in international organizations. You can't say to the Chinese, we're not going to give you the space. We're not going to reform the IMF. We're not going to change give you bigger role in the World Bank. We're not going to alternate the presidency of the ADP between Japan and China. But don't you dare go and form the AIIB. If we don't give China space, they will carve out a space for themselves. So there's a big agenda of research to be done. These are the people who are going to lead the effort, and they have students, and they're going to get their students to do more in this area. And so I'm very optimistic about the future, and I thank all of you, each and every one of you, for coming today and for sharing this wonderful occasion with me. Thank you.